This lecture is a series of lectures that I have the pleasure of recording at the UC San Diego Hospital. Not at all the ideal place to record an online lecture, but it is what it is. And I think the takeaway here is that art history waits for no one. So this lecture is about formal elements, the building blocks of art. What this means, the building blocks of art, are the small individual components that work together to make an overall composition. We're talking about things like line, shape, color, etc. There are quite a few formal elements, also known as visual elements in art, and in fact, you can take an entire class where the duration of the semester is spent studying just this one topic, formal elements, and design principles, but that's a different lecture. Now for us, as students of the ancient world, we're not going to go very in depth with the formal elements, and in fact, the ones that I have chosen to discuss in this lecture are the ones that will be most frequently seen in the artwork that we will be looking at this semester. So this is definitely a limited overview, and instead of spending an entire semester, we're going to spend about 20 to 30 minutes depending on how much talking I get myself into. Now before we get into the formal elements, let's first define this term right here, composition, because this is a term I'm going to be using quite frequently in this lecture, and I just want to make sure that everybody is understanding what I'm referring to. So when I talk about composition, what I'm referring to is the work of art in its entirety, all of the things. The lines, the shapes, the colors, the formal elements, of course, but also things like the material that the artist has used, and things like the size of the artwork. All components, the work of art in its totality, that is the composition. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a line. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, a line is a line. Why do we need to clarify beyond that? And actually a line is not a line. We look very specifically at lines when we are analyzing art, because different lines can convey different feelings or moods or different visual appearances. Now we're not going to learn about every single line. There are quite a few. We're going to learn about 3. We've got 2 of them here. We've got analytical and expressive lines. Now, analytical lines, an example of, you can see in the Solowitt work to your left. Analytical lines are sharp, straight lines. They don't bend, they don't curve, they are sharp and they are straight. Now, analytical lines, as you can see from this piece, can move in different directions. They can be horizontal, they can be diagonal, they can be vertical. Now, actually, the direction of the line is significant. I'm not going to go into that in this lecture, but you will learn about this when you do your reading on formal analysis. You'll learn that horizontal, vertical, and particularly diagonal lines actually can communicate certain ideas or certain feelings when used by an artist. And this is the point that I really want to make clear, and this is why our study of formal elements is so important. Art isn't really exactly this sort of magical thing that just sort of appears randomly out of the heart and the mind of the artist. The construction of a work of art usually occurs with a lot of strategy, because the artist is trying to say something, to communicate something specifically, and so they want to selectively work with lines, shapes, colors, etc. to convey that message. So something like a diagonal versus a horizontal line actually is going to end up being quite a significant choice in terms of what the artist is trying to communicate. Now, with our Jackson Pollock work, this is an example of an artwork that is using expressive lines, lines that curve every which way, that bend and twist and turn, different thicknesses, expression. The intent is to express. Now, when we look at formal elements in this lecture, we're going to actually look at them from 2 different directions. We do look at the visual qualities, what they look like, which I've just described to you, sharp and straight lines versus bending and curving lines. There also, though, is a psychological component. This is where a lot of the communication of the message will happen. Now, when I discuss this in this lecture, do keep in mind that this is something that's kind of a generalization. Obviously, not every single person is going to respond psychologically to the same work of art, but we don't have the time to sort of talk about every potential in terms of how people respond, so we'll just say generally. Now, generally, what happens is with analytical lines is they tend to emotionally isolate the viewer because they're so strict, they're so severe, they're placed just so. And so they're not meant to really make the viewer feel anything. And that's the whole point with this piece by Solo Witt. He's trying to get the viewer to think about the intersection between line, shape, text in a way that is analytical, that's rational, that it's objective. And there's not really a lot of room for emotion or the subjectivity of experiencing emotion in what the Witt is trying to say. And so he relies on analytical lines to really keep the viewer focused on kind of contemplating this really rational exercise in image making. Now, Jackson Pollock is very different. Jackson Pollock had a very difficult life. He had depression, he was an alcoholic, he had a very dysfunctional and tumultuous relationship with his wife. He had a whole host of issues, and he really felt that life was characterized by struggle and by angst. So what he did is he put the canvas on the ground and he got on top of it. And he used these expressive lines as this kind of like outpouring of emotion, of grief, of struggle, of angst. This is meant to just be, and it's so amazing using only line, this really intense conveying of emotion. His works of art tend to be rather large. So imagine standing in front of a piece like this that's the size of like a wall. It engulfs you. The fact that these lines occupy the entire space of the composition that makes them feel almost overwhelming. I think it's really something where we can get the sense of an intense expression of emotion through his use of line. Now, you don't have to write anything down here or just look. This is meant to just kind of practice and to show you some more examples and see if you can identify the two lines, some of the psychological ideas that they tend to communicate. See if you can determine which piece has the analytical lines and which piece has the expressive lines. The Judy Path piece with the expressive lines again seems to express more of an emotion, although maybe it's kind of hard to see what specifically that emotion is. And then our Barnett Newman piece we see here has the expressive line and maybe isn't quite as emotionally communicative as we might prefer or hope it to be. So now we're going to move on to implied line. Now, implied lines, these are a little bit different because these are lines that are implied. They're not lines that actually exist that the artist has come in and painted or drawn in. And in fact, I've gone in and put these lines in just so you could see where the implied lines are located. Now, the purpose of the implied lines are a couple. Okay, one implied line does kind of function to structure the composition, but more importantly, and this is really what we'll be focusing on this semester, is that the implied line functions to guide the viewer's eye. The artist carefully uses an implied line to make sure that the viewer is looking where they want the viewer to look. Now, Da Vinci here has put together this grouping of figures, and I've selected this painting to show you because of this grouping of figures. This grouping of figures features all three of the ways that an artist will typically make an implied line. One, an implied line is created through the direction of a glance. Now, the reason why this functions as an implied line is it has to do with human psychology. People in general are very nosy and they want to know what's going on. So if we see somebody that's looking at something, we're going to follow the direction of their gaze to see what they're looking at. So this is kind of the idea behind the direction of a glance. There is actually a specific term that we use for this, and this term is eye line. Eye, as in your eyes, eye line. So you can see an eye line here. Another way that implied line works is through gestures, and this is also kind of this idea that, someone's pointing at something, we want to see what they're indicating. So we have some gestures here that will be used as an implied line. And then finally, the third way that we can see an implied line being created is through the placement of figures. Now again, this has to do with psychology. In general, what will happen is a viewer will seek out faces. The reason why we look for faces is because, first of all, we see something of ourselves in other people. Also, we can see that perhaps faces might give us some clues or some information about what the artwork is about based on facial expression, body positioning, that sort of thing. So we really do seek out faces as a way to better understand what's being communicated to us. Now, Da Vinci, when he put together this composition, made the assumption that we're going to start right here. This is a really good assumption, and he does a good job of setting this up for us, for a few reasons. So first of all, he assumes that this is where we're going to start because he places this in the center. Most people, when they look at a work of art, they start in the center. Very few people start in the corner and sort of move their way up, although there is exceptions, and we'll look at an exception in the next slide. So he assumes we're going to start here because it's the center. He also assumes that we're going to start here because of the face, because again, remember I said people seek out faces. Now there's a third reason, and it has to do with color, but don't worry about that now. We're going to talk about color in a minute, and then we'll go back and we'll look, and I'll show you how this operates. So he thinks we're going to start right here. Now, from this though, it's a little bit more unclear what the viewer's going to do. Perhaps you might notice that she's looking down and you might be curious what she's looking at. So you would look down this way. Here's this cute little guy who is looking and gesturing this way to these people. Here's a hand that's going to lead you back up, and move your eye like this. Now you may have noticed the hand reaching down, and so you've moved down this way. You see the gesture, the pointing, the eye line that leads you here. The arm here leads you back up. The point is, regardless of which direction your gaze travels, you stay within this grouping of figures. This is where Da Vinci wants you to stay. He doesn't want you wandering back into this background, this rocky landscape. It's pointless. There is nothing there that's really communicating anything to us. It's just a scene that's framing this grouping of figures. This is where the message of the piece resides, and so he uses implied lines to keep our focus traveling around within this area. Let's take a look at another example, implied line, used by the wonderful artist Titian. Now Titian's done something interesting here. He's created this composition that has 3 distinct horizontal layers. Now, usually what happens is when we see artworks that are divided like this in these horizontal layers, we actually have an order that we read them in, and that is from bottom to top. And so we start at the bottom and move our way up. Now you can see I've drawn in the implied lines, and you can see that I've chosen to start the implied lines with these 2 figures here. Can you guess why I would have chosen to put these lines here? What about these figures is capturing your attention? Really look and see. Think about this for a minute. It's the red of the robes. So the red of the robes is really a bright and intense color that captures our eye. Now again, this has to do with color, so I'll come back to this painting and explain this further in a minute. The red jumps out, captures our attention, and what happens is once I notice these 2 people, I notice the eye line, I notice the gesture, and that sends me up here to this middle figure right here. Now she also, this is Mary, she captures our attention as well because she has the same red robe. Not a coincidence, right? No coincidences in art or life. That's what I like to say. So she has the same red robe, which of course is going to capture our attention. What also captures our attention is the fact there's so much space around her in a composition that's otherwise quite crowded. All these people down here sort of shoved together, all these little angel babies here, together, and then this open space, which really makes her very prominent visually. We don't get overwhelmed by detail. We focus on her. Now there's one more very important part to this piece that Titian wants to make sure that we don't overlook, and it's this guy called God, which is up here. Now, what he does, as you can see, we've got the eye line and the gesture, which leads the eye up so that we notice, oh yeah, hey, God is part of this situation as well. Now, Titian And his choices with God is important to think about. Imagine that God wasn't there. Okay, there's just a golden sky, empty. What would happen is the eye line and the gestures would lead the viewer's eye straight out of the composition. Titian doesn't want us to leave the composition. He wants us to stay and look in and take in all of this loveliness. So God looks down, which actually sends the viewer down this way. So the viewer is looking up and down, up and down. I personally think that this is really smart on Titian's part for a couple reasons. Of course, it keeps us looking at all parts of the composition, but the other thing is Titian put himself in a potentially dangerous situation by making these three different horizontal levels so distinct. Kind of breaks up the unity of the piece, makes it seem sort of disjointed. There's not quite a nice visual flow that would really help with the continuity of the narrative as we move from the lower to the uppermost areas of the composition. The movement of the eye back and forth kind of brings it all together and gives it that sense of unity. Unity is really important, and when you watch your Principles of Design lecture, you will get to learn about that firsthand. Let's move on to shape. Now, the good news about shape is that shape is really similar to line, so I don't really need to go into a lot of depth with this slide because many of the things that I said about line, they are the same about shape because shapes are made from lines. So if you look at this piece here on the left by Mondrian, this is an example of an artwork that is comprised of geometric shapes. So geometric shapes are composed of what type of lines? They're composed of analytical lines, those sharp, straight lines. So now you can see what I'm talking about when you talk about the relationship between line and shape. Now, geometric shapes are shapes that have borders that are sharp and straight. Triangles, squares, rectangles, parallelograms, octagons, all of these type of shapes. Now, one shape, though, that is technically not a geometric shape is a circle. Now, you might think, well, yes, it is because we learned about it in geometry. And this is true, but in art, we like to do things a little bit different from those mathematicians. Technically, a circle is what we call a curvilinear shape. But don't worry, you don't have to know that for this class. I'm just telling you this because in my face-to-face class, this is always a question that students ask, what about a circle? So I'm just imagining that many of you out there in internet land are wondering the same thing. Now here we've got in the Miro painting examples of biomorphic shapes, which are irregularly shaped shapes, odd shapes. We call them biomorphic shapes because they are reminiscent of the odd shapes that we see in amoeba and all of these other biological organisms. Another name that you might encounter in regards to a biomorphic shape, and it means the same thing, is organic shape. Now, in terms of the psychology, it's the same. Geometric shapes are kind of like analytical lines. They're strict, they're rigid, there's a rationality and objectivity that doesn't really tend to incite emotion, where you can see with Miro's piece and the use of the biomorphic shape that this is something that's much more whimsical, imaginative, expressive. Now, again, you don't have to write anything down, just look and see if you can identify which piece is relying on biomorphic versus geometric shapes. And again, this is the point. So for example, Donald Judd's piece, this is a sculpture that's produced in the style of minimalism. The whole point of minimalism is nothing. Do not feel, don't think, don't anything. Just appreciate the objecthood, the shape of the piece. So no emotion involved, just appreciating the squareness of squares. That's modern art. All right, let's talk about mass. Now, there's a lot of things going on here, but luckily it's not as complicated as all the words on this screen may suggest. Before we talk about mass, I want to talk about dimensionality. Again, I don't want to assume that people are bringing any sort of prior knowledge into the class. I just want to make sure we understand this term three-dimensional. What this term three-dimensional is referring to is works of art that occupy our real physical space, fully rounded objects. So examples of this would be sculpture and architecture. This is opposed to two-dimensional works of art, which are flat, things like paintings and drawings. Now, in this class, we are going to look pretty much exclusively at three-dimensional artwork. Painting was not really a common artistic practice in the ancient world. Of course, there are exceptions, but we are not going to see very many of them. So this is why I'm really focusing on three-dimensional expressions of mass, more so than two-dimensional expressions. So when we talk about mass in general as a formal element, we're talking about the weight, the heaviness, the size even, kind of. Be careful with that, because scale more so refers to size, but the sense of heaviness, of weight. Weight and size I mention because they certainly have a relationship. Now, when we talk about mass, we do have to clarify if we are referring to an expression of mass in a three-dimensional or a two-dimensional form. If we're talking about a three-dimensional expression of mass, we're going to say actual mass. The reason why we say actual mass is because these works of art have actual material that has a real actual mass that comprises of a real actual object that occupies our actual space. All of the actualities. We're referring to this in a very literal way. Now, if we were talking about two-dimensional artwork, we actually would say implied mass. So imagine like a painting of a person. We are implying, or the artist's implying in that painting, three-dimensionality, making it look like a fully rounded form by techniques such as shading, overlap, etc., but in actuality, it's being implied. That person isn't actually there as a three-dimensional rounded form, actual mass. Now, we can and should be more specific in the type of mass that we're seeing beyond actual mass. Open form mass and closed form mass. Now, the good news is that these terms are descriptive, so they shouldn't be too hard to wrap our brains around. Right here on the right, we have an example of closed form mass that's closed in on itself. We have no openings and nothing that is coming out into the space around, closed form. Now over here, the Giacometti sculpture, this is an example of an open form mass. Opens in the mass, right? Openings in the mass. You have spaces in the mass, which you see here, and you have parts of the sculpture that come out into space as well. Now, I chose to pair these to show you not only because they're really different approaches to mass, which I do want you to see that, they also have a conceptual similarity in that both of these, believe it or not, actually relate to the same historical event, which is World War II. Now, the reason why I'm telling you this is because, like line, we do have visual as well as psychological properties that we need to consider. This is a Holocaust memorial, so it's memorializing the people who lost their lives in the Holocaust. Now think about this for a minute. What is the point of a memorial? What is its function? The point of a memorial is to memorialize, to remember. We don't want to simply remember for a week or a month. We theoretically want to remember forever. And so think about her choice of closed form mass. Closed form mass tends to convey a sense of permanence, of stability, of strength. This idea of remembering forever. This is going nowhere. And part of what gives it that sense of being so permanent is her choice of closed form mass. Now, this sculpture by Giacometti, as you can see, is very different. I think you would probably agree with me that this sculpture does not convey this same sense of strength and permanence that the White Reed Holocaust Memorial does. This is the point. So Giacometti, he witnessed the atrocities of the Second World War. And these were horrors that man had not, and actually we're very lucky, have not since had to witness. Since he witnessed the Holocaust, the extermination of so many people at the hands of Hitler. He witnessed the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. He saw unparalleled levels of human casualty, the decimation of cities, of the landscape, I mean, all kinds of things. It was really harrowing for people to experience the Second World War. What we see is that after the Second World War, there's an emergence of a philosophy known as existentialism, which put very generally is this idea that humanity is morally bankrupt, life has no meaning, tradition is pointless, there is no God. How could there be a God that would allow all of these horrible things to happen? Basically, it's just like the most negative, pessimistic outlook on life that you could imagine. So think about how these ideas might be communicated through this sculpture by Giacometti. This idea of this sculpture of this man, he's like wasting away. He's being engulfed by space. You get the sense that man is weak, that he's not strong. You get the idea of a sense of hopelessness, and he's trying to communicate these ideas, relying primarily on mass. All right, let's talk about color. Now, color is kind of like formal elements in general, and that this is a very complicated topic. This is another class that you can take an entire semester and look only at color. It's called color theory. And for many artists, it's a requirement to take this class. I'll be honest with you, I never took color theory because I was always too scared. I heard it was really hard. I don't recommend living your life by fear, and I regret not taking this class. But it is something that is on my to-do list for the future. Good news for us is that because we don't really look at painting in this class, we're not really going to go very in depth in color. I'm only actually going to talk to you about a couple things. What we're going to talk about are warm and cool colors. Now, this right here is called a color wheel, and basically it kind of is a circular arrangement of colors that helps us to get an idea of color relationships. You do not have to memorize this or know this for this class, but this is something that's helpful to look at, and you will be looking at a color wheel in this lecture, obviously, and you'll learn a little bit more about color in your reading on formal analysis. Now, warm colors are colors that are yellow, orange, and red, which we can see are next to each other on the color wheel. We call them warm colors because we associate them with things that are warm, like fire and the sun. Now, visually, warm colors jump out at the viewer. Cool colors, green, blue, violet, also next to each other on the color wheel. These colors we associate with things that are cool, like water and grass. Cool colors recede back into space. Now, I chose this painting by Peter Paul Rubens because I think this is a really fascinating and fantastic example of warm and cool colors. Now, in this piece, you can see that actually Rubens has put in quite a bit of warm colors. In fact, and this is just my kind of take on it, it's almost kind of aggressive how many warm colors he's putting in here. This is a composition that's almost completely dominated by warm colors. And as these warm colors jump out at the viewer, I sort of feel like this painting's almost like punching me in the face. It's just coming out with so much of these warm colors. Now, interestingly, coincidence but not a coincidence, because there's no such thing as coincidences in art or life, a random blue sleeve on this dress. The blue sleeve is here because, as we know, cool colors recede, and it's kind of functioning to hold this back so that we're not being completely bombarded with our warm colors. There's a sense of restraint. Can you see where else he's put cool colors in? We have this background here. Now, once again, this is something to be thankful for. This is a really crowded composition. I personally am kind of phobed out in this right now, a little claustrophobic, and so this gives us a sense of depth and a sense of space. I personally take it as a source of visual relief. I come in back here, there's a sense of space, I can catch my breath, I don't like crowds. Calm down, and then come back and start taking in all of this intense warm colors. Now let's go back a little bit here. So remember this painting by Da Vinci? One of the things that Da Vinci did to kind of help to really make this the point of the spot where the viewer is going to start looking at the painting is He puts in a warm color, which, as we know, jumps out at the viewer. But if you look, you can see surrounding this area of warm color, we have cool colors. What this does is it sets a warm, cool color contrast. The reason why this is important is he's putting two opposites next to each other. When you put two opposites next to each other, you create contrast, sort of this jarring. And the contrast is something that'll capture the viewer's attention. So the warm, cool color contrast really makes sure that this is where our eye is initially attracted to when we first look at this painting. Now here, Titian, right? Here we again have these red robes. Now we understand why these were so prominent to us visually when we first started looking at this painting. The warm colors jump out at the viewer. Now we also have a bit of a contrast because you can notice next to the red are greens. This is a warm, cool color contrast. Another thing you're going to learn about when you do your reading is that this is also called a complementary color scheme. Complementary color schemes are colors that are opposite of one another on the color wheel. Now be careful with this term complementary. It's misleading. Whoever came up with this name did nobody any favors. You might be thinking, oh, complementary. They complement each other. They're friends. They get along. These colors are not friends. They don't get along. They're jarring and they contrast against one another. But here is that word contrast, right? So this idea that because it contrasts, it's very vivid and it catches the viewer's eye. So we've got sort of a double contrast going on here with not only a warm, cool color contrast, but a complementary color scheme as well. And so if we go back, here is a color wheel, right? Red and green opposite one another on the color wheel. And so you can go in and you can see where we would have other complementary color schemes. Violet and yellow, orange and blue. Now, of course, we can go way farther into this, split complementaries, all of that. Don't even worry about that. We're really, really general in our understanding of color in Art 200. This is our last slide, and we're going to be looking at implied depth. And the reason why it says implied depth is because you can see that we're looking at a two-dimensional work of art. This is a drawing by the artist, or excuse me, it's a painting. It's an ink painting by the artist Mu Qi, Chinese artist. And I chose this painting for a couple reasons. First of all, because I think persimmons are delicious. And secondly, because this is a painting that has both examples of implied depth that we're going to encounter in this class. Now, there's bad news and there's good news for people who are new to the study of art history. The bad news is actually space, and the representation of implied space in art is super complicated. Good news is those complexities don't really emerge until the Renaissance, which is beyond the scope of this class. We do see a brief moment of some complex space, and this is such a wonderful moment in the history of painting, and it happens in Rome. But that's not something that we really need to concern ourselves about. We're going to look at these two very simple, very straightforward techniques for applying depth, which you will see over and over and over again in this class: vertical placement and overlap. Now, vertical placement, basically what the idea is that higher up vertically something is in the composition, the farther back in space it appears. So this row of persimmons looks like it's farther back in space because it's higher up vertically than this persimmon here. Our other technique is overlap, which we see here. This is also fairly straightforward. This persimmon looks closer to us because we can see it in its entirety. It partially obstructs this persimmon right here, which kind of gives the look that this is farther back in space because it's being obscured by something in front of it. And this concludes our lecture on formal elements.